So thank you. And it's a fascinating paper, and I really enjoyed reading it, and I'm delighted to be able to talk to you about it now. So just a few words to begin before I ask you a couple questions, I guess, right? So
Sure.
From what I understood of the paper, which is it's about the relationship of the artwork to the act that produces the artwork,
Right.
more or less, right? And so it's about the relationship between form and intention in a way, which is a great topic.
Yeah. So, for me, really, so actually, when you think of it that way, one of the first essays I ever read in literary theory was Paul de Man's Form and Intent in the
Okay.
American Criticism.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know if you've ever read that essay, but it was actually one of de Man's better essays. And I've always been a fan of de Man, although I sort of have, I came out on the opposite side of everything. And the first half of that essay is kind of critique of American new criticism on the grounds that what it does is, in effect, produce these great close readings, but it does so by hypostasizing the work of art, by treating it as if it were a natural object. And de Man sort of unpacks the difference between intentional objects and natural objects in there. So I just thought that was kind of useful, although de Man himself then, in effect, moved to a position in the purloined ribbon, when he in his full deconstructed mode, when in fact he treated everything as if it were all forms of language as if it were in fact a natural object. So he doubled down on the mistake he suggested the new critics made. But what I thought was useful about that essay, and I haven't really thought of it in these terms till now, is that de Man also says something else. And this is like, I don't know, maybe that essay was written maybe 1968 or 1969, so it's somewhere around, this moment. And I'm sure he had no more been reading Elizabeth Anscombe than, let's say, Steve Knapp and I had been like 10 years later when we were doing Against Theory. But he says something about when you're thinking about intention, it's important to sort of think about it the right way. And the example he gives is, he says, if a carpenter is making a chair, it's crucial to know what the chair is. You have to know that it's meant by someone to be a chair. But this does not mean you have to be asking yourself, what is the carpenter thinking as he's making the chair? Because, of course, it's completely obvious. The carpenter could be thinking, when's dinner? Or, man, am I bored making chairs? Or whatever the carpenter is thinking. But that has nothing to do with the intentional act of the chair. So, in other words, it disarticulates what is present to someone's consciousness, which is what Kamel would call, really in almost exactly the same year, the bad picture of intention, i.e., what's going on inside your head, from the necessity of understanding the intentional structure of any act. So the way to do that right, is the way Anscombe, in my view, right, is the way Anscombe then does it, or had done it already in 58 in Intentional, but it's not a book that I read for a long time. So, but if you look at art in the period, art in the period gets very much concerned with what it means for a work of art, on the one hand, to have a relation to an act, the way you said, and on the other hand, not to be intended. And so for me, it was a way of beginning to think about how to understand this moment in the history of art and a lot of what's happened afterwards as having less to do, or not exactly to do with what kind of object the work of art is, but rather having to do with the work of art as part of an intent, or as an element in a product of an intentional structure, and the way in which the intentional structure was in effect built into it.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I think you brought up the de Man essay in your Against Theory early essay, and it seemed to me as I read this essay in front of us tonight, that it reminded me of a couple of things from your Against Theory essay. Now, I wasn't thinking about the de Man link or anything, but I was thinking about how you refuse the separation between intention and effect, essentially, which seems to remind me of the way you had earlier talked about refusing a separation between intention and meaning.
Well, so the thing about it is, though, is you want to say there's not a difference between intention and intended effect, but there's a difference between intention and effect in this sense, which is that the effect a work of art produces can be like totally other than the one you meant it to produce. Derrida and everybody else was right when they said you can't control the actual effect. You can try your hardest, but you can't do it. But it's completely right. A lot of this comes out of just thinking about, so Steve Knapp and I have recently been in touch again. We're thinking about writing another essay, how you do Against Theory if you're going to do it now. And I'm inspired by like a line, I haven't got it quite right, that I remember from when I used to read a lot of Ezra Pound a long time ago. Pound says somewhere, I think it's in the ABC of Reading, One of the pleasures of middle age is finding out how totally right you were when you were younger.
Mhm.
That's from my view. We want to start this essay by saying, if it's pleasurable in middle age, imagine how pleasurable it is when you're really old.
Yeah,
Still
right.
find out how right you were when you were younger.
Yeah, when
So
you're,
the idea is, to begin to think through sort of
Mhm.
the claims that against theory makes. But if you were making it now, not in the sort of, completely off the example. I mean, everything in against theory was done off the example, but we're also trying to sort of suggest how that worked in a kind of larger structure of intention. I remember the philosopher and writer about art, super smart guy, Richard Volheim, asking me and Steve at one of the many, many, many events we did after against theory came out, what our theory of intention was. And I remember saying to him with a kind of happiness that could only be the product of ignorance. It didn't matter what our theory of intention was. What we were saying was true for every theory of intention. So that's not, strictly speaking, true. That is, what we were saying kind of entailed a certain theory of intention, and not others. And we had no idea which one it was, and we had no idea even that had an entailment.
Right.
So the way is to sort of work backwards now from that to this. So yeah, it is a kind of return to against
So
theory.
how would you, just to be more specific about that, how would you work backward? What is more or less the relationship? Because one of my questions is if the effect is not the same as an effect can be different in every time. For example, you can have any intention and it could be either a successful or a failed or any other type of effect that comes out, as you say in your paper. So it's not the same as meaning, actually, at all.
So it's not the same. No, that's exactly right. The effect's not the same. The point's going to be is that to understand a text and to experience the effect it has on you are two different things. They may completely overlap, right? But they're logically separate, just in the sense that, I mean, the obvious example would be the one people always use about this, which is a joke. So someone tells you a joke. I mean, to understand it, you have to understand it's meant to be a joke. Whether you laugh is a different question.
Right.
So the intended effect of the joke is to make you laugh. You have to have a relation to that effect, i.e., to understand that the intended effect is to make you laugh. Otherwise, you don't understand what it is. But the question of whether you laugh is a different question. So for me, if you begin to think about, and actually one of the fundamental, problems in sort of um, early deconstruction's account of this, I mean, in Derridian deconstruction in particular, is when Derrida, in sort of signature event context, and he doubles down limited ink, really kind of almost structurally confuses the effect of the utterance
Right.
with the meaning of the utterance.
Right.
So what he'll say is, well, the problem with intentionality is that it cannot govern the scene of utterance. So that means you can't guarantee you'll produce the right effect. It has nothing to do with the question of the meaning of the utterance.
Right.
So it's important to make that distinction. So for me, the against theory thing was about making that distinction. But what's important in the art part of it, because against theory, the argument for intentionalism is just an argument about all speech acts, all art, everything. But in thinking about art, the question here was, in someone like Robert Morris, who I've become like, much to some of my friends' dismay. For example, like Michael Fried and Todd Cronin. But I become kind of intrigued by Morris, and
I
actually
see
think
that.
I'm
It's
drawing
our,
sort of beautiful,
yeah,
which is
his
not.
anti-form essay that you're bring up.
Yeah.
Very
So
interesting.
the thing would be is that you sort of think, well, um, Morris completely was a kind of anti-intentionalist in a certain way. Um, he completely was at the same time kind of committed to what he thought of as action instead of the artifact, which was another way of making the same kind of mistake. But in anti-form, when he talks about the success of someone like Pollock, and then his other example in a kind of almost parenthesis is Morris Lewis, their success, he says, is something like holding on to the process and making it part of the end form of the work. So
Right.
process itself is just a causal account of how you made the painting. So it could be interesting, it could not be interesting. If the painting itself is just a record of the process, it's not interesting either. But if somehow what the painting does is take the process and make it part of the form, that's what he was interested in. So that to me was what was important about this.
And is this interesting in terms of your overall argument because that bringing the process into the form is related to the idea of making the intention apparent in the form.
Yeah, and making it clear that in a certain way it's about making the intention apparent. For me, a lot of the photographers I've been writing about, in particular, it's not that their photographs somehow uniquely mean what they meant them to mean as opposed to other people's photographs. On the kind of the against theory model, everybody's photographs mean what they mean them to mean. You haven't got it's not like you haven't really got a choice about that.
Right.
It's that given the history, both the aesthetic history and then in a different way the political history of the last, let's say, half century, it's important to them that that's part of their meaning. In other words, what they mean is that they mean what they mean. They require you to recognize. You don't understand it unless you understand not that they're just that they're intentional, but they're about their intentionality, their assertion of their intentionality, which from my standpoint is exactly the same as being an assertion of their autonomy. You can't do intentionality without autonomy. You can't do autonomy without intentionality. So in a way, what you get in someone like Morris is a kind of recognition of that. That's what he's saying, I think. He says the process has to be made into the form. If it's just process, yes, just what they did. But if they make it into part of the form, it's taken up by the form, then it's somehow about the process and not just an indexical trace of the process.
Right. This is actually another question that I wanted to ask you, which is really fascinating. You're starting to lead to in talking about the political ramifications of this and the idea of autonomy. And because you're doing a gesture you're doing something that I find totally fascinating, which is to recuperate, to redeem the idea of form from conservative idea of simple formalism, and bring it towards a more Marxist view, in which you're establishing that autonomy and intentionality that as it's embodied or apparent in form can be something that is politically can be understood on the left. And so I'd like to hear you talk about that more. Can you explain that more?
Yeah, so the basic idea really would just be, it is kind of, both, I think it's sort of simple, but it's often complicated and it's not, I've come to see it's not as obvious to others as it has seemed occasionally to me. So I've made clear enough. But the basic idea of it is this, is that I don't think the autonomy of the work of art is, as it were, as such on the left politically. I think the autonomy of the work of art has come to be in a particular way on the left, again, in what we might call the neoliberal period, precisely because neoliberalism, deeply relies on a kind of, in aesthetics, refusal of autonomy. What I mean by that is that insofar as the sort of neoliberal model of social justice, what Fried and I call left neoliberalism, is anti-discrimination and meritocracy and equality of opportunity. It deeply relies on how people see each other, on how people relate to each other, on people overcoming their prejudices, on people overcoming the legacy of past prejudice, et cetera, et cetera. That is, it deeply does, in effect, what I think is the great triumph ideologically of neoliberalism. It turns justice, social justice, into a kind of intersubjective set of relations. And it does that only by removing class from the structure of society. Because class is not in the same way an intersubjective relation. That is, the relation of capital to labor is a relation of exploitation that is not crucially influenced. It's marginally influenced by it's better to have a good boss than a bad boss. And it's better, no doubt, to be a bad worker than a good worker in some way. But that's really not crucial. The crucial thing is the relation between capital and labor as such, in which how you feel about each other is a kind of, thing indifferent. So to me, one of the things that happens in this kind of work, and you begin to see this kind of work, with something like Jeff Wall's Mimic in the early 1980s, and then see it increasingly over the last almost now 40 years, is that you begin to develop a kind of aesthetics of indifference. And the aesthetics of indifference is an aesthetics where the work doesn't care how you feel about it. It's actually, we're indifferent to the effect it has on you. It's committed only to its meaning and to your understanding its internal structure. Whereas the sort of open postmodern view of photography is that photography has no internal structure. It's open to the world on one side, it's open to the beholder on the other. It's a kind of venue in the Baktian sense, right, for a certain kind of intersubjectivity. So for me, in our period, Adolf says, is a very simple, but I think kind of useful definition of neoliberalism. It's like capitalism without any resistance from the working class. So one of the things you want to say is that, okay, what the photograph helps us see is the class structure underneath the intersubjective structure.
Mhm.
It helps us see the class structure that neoliberalism has all too successfully educated us out of seeing. So that doesn't mean that photography counts as kind of left resistance. Helping you see the class structure is better than not seeing it, but it's not working
Sure.
class resistance to capitalism.
Sure.
But it is a way in which you can begin to see what you ought to be resisting rather than what left neoliberalism resists. Left neoliberalism, is basically it's an ethics. You shouldn't discriminate. You totally shouldn't discriminate.
Right.
It's a neoliberal virtue. But in effect, that doesn't make it an anti-capitalist politics. Why would neoliberal virtues be anti-capitalist politics? So it still is a virtue. That is, none of the photographers I'm interested in are, as it were, in favor of discrimination. They're not saying the alternative to anti-racism is racism. They're saying the alternative to a neoliberal ethics is a left politics, not a neoliberal ethics.
Right. And to talk about the idea of autonomy and in its relationship with, on one hand, aesthetics, and the other side, politics, because it has a long history in the idea of politics as well. Is there a way in which the this autonomy as an agent, because it has the autonomy of the work is coming from an agency of the artist, that it has intentionality. Therefore, just because we recognize that agency, it has a form of resistance in terms of a larger political milieu. That is, it has an idea of action, as opposed to something that is something simply determined by the beholder. Anybody can see it in any way they might want to. But
that's interesting. Yeah, I actually hadn't thought of it that way, but I hadn't thought of it that way. But how I was thinking of it was, well, yeah, the point is that to see it as an action is to see it then as its meaning, if not its effect, is determined by the agent. And that's part of that determinates autonomy. But you're putting more on the action, which I sort of like that idea, which is that it gives you a model of what an action is.
Right.
In effect, every work of art from that standpoint would be a kind of reminder of what an action is and of the power of an action in that sense. So it's limited. It's the power to mean whatever it is you mean to produce what you meant to produce. And again, that's not like a kind of resistance to capital, but it's a kind of model for what the resistance to capital ought to be.
Exactly.
So,
it's an establishment of human agency, as opposed to the overbearing capitalism that oppresses us simply and makes us non-agents, in fact.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, no, now that's part of my argument because you said it. But I hadn't thought of it exactly in those terms. I was thinking in sort of more formal terms.
Right. It's a kind of resistance idea that might be interesting. Anyway, we might need to stop here because we've talked already for 20 minutes.